All right. So, as I just said, my name's Aaron Crosman. I am a senior consultant with Attain, which is a large IT consulting firm, and I work within the Salesforce Services Group, specializing in Drupal to Salesforce integrations. And my talk this evening and our discussion is centered around being self-taught and personal development, and how do we kind of acquire the skills we need to survive, both specifically within Drupal, but much more broadly, hopefully, with other fields and kind of generally applicable. Because in truth, to survive in really any career, but particularly to technical careers, we all have to be learning new skills all the time. In the Drupal community in particular, you'll often hear people draw a distinction between being formally trained or being self-taught. And it'll sometimes come with like this ring of pride of like, I am self-taught. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I figured this whole thing out on my own. I am tougher than everybody else. You'll also sometimes hear it with kind of like a ring of shame or embarrassment of like, I'm self-taught. I like read some blog posts and slapped together a website and some dude paid me for it. I have no idea what I'm doing. And the reality is we're a community without a lot of formal training programs or certifications. So even those of us who have formal backgrounds in computer science or IT had to probably figure out most of Drupal on our own, or at least through a series of informal interactions. And so, figuring out nodes and entities and taxonomies and hooks and menus and all that other fun Drupal jargon is something that is largely an informal process for most of us. The technologies I learned in a CS degree in college 20 years ago have largely either gone the way of the dinosaurs or are fading rapidly or just so outmoded that they don't look anything like what I was taught back at that point. And so I've had to learn a variety of technologies over the course of my career. And I kind of expect there's going to be 2, maybe 3 more generations of technology before I retire. And so the vast majority of what I know is information I acquired on my own informally. It's not been a formal training program. And I think that becomes true for everybody over the arc of our careers. And so these are kind of strategies that I've picked up or seen from other people that have worked for me and for them. And the first baseline assumption that I think everybody needs to make is to work from the assumption that whatever it is you are doing the first time through a project was probably at least mostly wrong. It can feel awesome to get a project out the door, right? That feeling of success, I've got it out the door, I've got it launched, it's in the wild, this must be cool because it works. And that's worthy of pride, and you've worked hard, you've accomplished something, you should take a minute and celebrate. You have done something hard. But there was probably a moment, 3/4 of the way through the project where you're like, oh, that's what you're supposed to do with this thing. If I'd known that like 3 weeks ago, I would have done this whole part different. And you need to go back and look at that piece and say, okay, what would have happened if I'd done this whole part differently? As opposed to just like, well, this worked last time, so I'm going to do it again that way because I don't want to risk screwing it up. You really need to go back and push yourself forward. The picture that's up is from just up the road at the Riverbank Zoo, and you can kind of see the hatchling poking his head out of there from under the wing of the bird in the center. This is from a visit I took a few years ago with my mother to the zoo, and you need to understand my mother is super into zoos, and she is super into flamingos. So when the flamingos had their hatchlings, there was really nothing else we were going to do for a while but sit around and watch the hatchlings interact. And it also turns out my mother, because she's really into zoos, has kind of a sixth instinct for like finding the keeper or the docent who actually knows the animal and isn't just like wandering around giving tours, but is the expert. So we ended up chatting with the keeper for about 20 minutes. And it turns out the Riverbank Zoo is the zoo that is responsible for the breeding book for flamingos in zoos in North America, which, if you know about zoos, is a thing that is a mark of real distinction for zoos, particularly a small zoo like Riverbanks, because every zoo in the country that has flamingos that are breeding reports them to Riverbank Zoo, and they track the book. And they are tracking every breeding pair across every zoo in North America, or at least every responsible zoo. And each species in the zoos has a book that's kept at a zoo. And that's how all trades of those animals are coordinated. So it's a big deal, particularly for a relatively small zoo. And one of the things you have to do to get that privilege is you have to be excellent at caring for the animals, and particularly at breeding the animals. And so the zookeeper got talking about how they'd gotten there. And I'm sure the technical details have changed slightly, and I may have misremembered some of the detail, but in generally, they figured out these breeding mounds first. That these are things that birds do in the wild, and you can't just let a zoo in an enclosure, or a flamingo in an enclosure do this on its own. The keepers had to build them for the flamingos, because otherwise they put them in stupid spots and they don't have enough dirt, and there's a variety of kind of logistical problems that humans are pretty good at solving in artificial settings. So they build these mounds, and that alone was enough to get to kind of technically successful. There were more birds being born than were passing away. That's what your baseline is. Your breeding program working is your population growing, but they were only kind of barely successful. And because what happens is at night, foxes and other local predators come in and they steal eggs off the mounds. Flamingos are not super tough birds to stand up to a fox. And so the obvious solution to that is they've got these nice tough buildings, so you can take the egg inside and put it in an incubator, and now your egg is perfectly protected, and you can raise it under ideal conditions. You can do all the research to figure out what is the ideal condition for a flamingo egg. Problem is, the adult birds, well, they're birds and not super bright, not dumb enough to realize that the egg is gone. And when a bird loses its egg, it gives up. And so they were now having to hand rear the hatchlings because nobody, the flock wouldn't adopt them. You had to get started. This created this whole slew of other problems that they hadn't had before. But the hatch rate went up rather markedly. And so they didn't want to go back to putting them out on the exhibit, but they needed some way to get the birds to stay put. So they kept thinking about it, realized that birds aren't super bright and don't have super sensitive detail checking of these eggs. If you say put some plastic balls out underneath the bird, it kind of thinks the egg is still there, and you can let it incubate this plastic ball for a couple of weeks and then swap it back at the last minute. And now the hatchling pops out just underneath the wing where it's supposed to, and it gets there and it gets bonded to its parent, and the parent bird bonds it and welcomes it into the flock, and just all the things a flamingo is supposed to do. All this is to say that was started with a successful breeding program. But they wanted to be among the best. They wanted to be world class. And to do that, they had to keep trying. And they made mistakes and introduced problems that they then had to solve to keep moving themselves forward. But that is how you become the best. And how you move forward is you keep at your problems and you don't say, I've met my baseline of success, I'm done. You keep pushing, you keep evolving, and you keep learning from taking criticism to understand where you want to go. Getting criticism, most everybody kind of understands pretty quickly in their careers, is critical to growing. That you have to hear what you've done wrong so you can know what you've done and so that you can improve. And so receiving criticism, people can often recognize as maybe uncomfortable but necessary. If you're working in a team, giving criticism is also super critical, because otherwise the team is not moving. You're not learning from one another and you're not moving forward as a team. And so particularly within teams, having a full give and take of criticism is really important. And for those who aren't comfortable with that, I don't really know a better way to do it other than art courses. Learning kind of basic critique and criticism and give and take in that is standard fare in any art course. You're going to do critiques with your classmates, you're going to do critiques with the instructor, you'll be receiving criticism from all of those folks, you'll be providing it back to your classmates. And that basic process is really critical to just being in the arts. The mugs that are up are a pair that are left over from a ceramics course I took in college. And these are still ones that I use in our daily lives, but they are kind of a pair of mugs that I will often tell people made me a better developer. And there's a variety of reasons why I think that's true. But in this particular case, it was that process of going through the criticism and going through the critique. So the way this course worked was we did kind of ongoing criticism with classmates throughout. And so we were kind of getting that give and take throughout the course. And then at the end, the professor liked the big, high stress, kind of big moment critique at the end. And so it was literally a process of like, you had all these assignments and it didn't matter really when you did them. What mattered was what you showed up for in your half-hour slot at the end of the semester and what made it to that table. It did not matter if you did it at the last minute. It did not matter if it blew up in the kiln. It did not matter if you dropped it as you walked across the room to the critique. If it did not make it on that table, it did not exist. So I got to that critique with the various things in my assignment, having carefully carried them across the room, including 6 matching mugs, of which I only needed 4. But I made a couple of backups because I'm not a total idiot. But the assignment was just 4 matching mugs. That's all the assignment was. And so all of the aesthetic choices about these mugs are mine. So their size, their shape, the porcelain slip lining, the clear glaze, the shape and size of the handle, all of those are my choices. And the professor we talked about that a little bit. But he was focused on the assignment, not those pieces. And the assignment was 4 matching mugs. And so he ripped into the technical about where they didn't perfectly match, where there's a little bit of curve on the one on the left and not on the one on the left. Right, the 2 handles aren't quite things. The fact that the slip lining isn't consistent was part of the design, so that was fine. But the size and shape should have been perfect. And it was that blending of aesthetics with technical precision. And common in the arts is that blending, right? If you take photography, if you do any kind of sculpture, most graphic design, there is that blending between an aesthetic part and a technical part, and you have to be able to do both. That's true in programming, that's true in lots of technical work. It's true in technical writing. You have to blend some technical precision and some grace and elegance. And those are things you can really emphasize as you go through things in the arts, and learning to pull those together and going through those processes together. The last of the general pieces I want to touch on is the importance of mentorship. And particularly having multiple mentors. It doesn't necessarily need to be formal, structured mentorship, although those can be really valuable relationships and really helpful. But you need to have people throughout your career, in your life, who are willing to share their experiences, both their success and their failure, and who can talk you through the challenges you're working on and give you a sounding board and help process. Again, they don't even need to have to know they're mentoring you. They just have to be part of those kinds of conversations. And I stick to multiple mentors because it forces us to reconcile the various things they're teaching us and to get to the meanings behind the rules they may lay out. A lot of us, as you distill down lessons in life, you may come up with kind of a shorthand rule that you then know is the way to be successful at some kind of task. And you'll share that with people, right? I figured out this shortcut, and here's this rule. If you just do X, you'll be fine. And that's often a shorthand for a large, deep set of learning you've done, and you kind of distilled it down of here's how to avoid this whole deep pit over here. I can do this thing. But when you're starting to share those with mentors and you're starting to blend together ideas from various mentors, you have to start to understand that purpose of what is this rule achieving, not just blindly following it. I had the opportunity early in my career to have an excellent pair of mentors. One of them was the IT director at the organization I worked for, and he'd come through the GE Jack Welch management track. He'd done a really nice job of rejecting pieces of that are toxic and keeping the pieces of it that he thought were good, and being mindful that had a lot of both. If you read anything on that program, most good outside folks will say there's a lot of both in that Jack Welch system. And Bob had kind of his collection of what he wanted to teach. And some of it was that intentional mentoring, and some of it was that kind of escalating project nature that's part of that program. If you keep giving people harder and harder projects, only in the Jack Welch system, you're supposed to eventually fail and fall hard on your nose, and it's supposed to be a terrible, horrible, painful experience. And Bob didn't think that taught you much. And so when you got to those projects, and when I got to that project, he tossed me an extra person to help backstop so I wouldn't just fall on my face. And so that's where Frank came in. And Frank was a more senior programmer who helped me out with a particular project that was way above my capacity at the time. And they had a lot of shared information and shared styles and things that worked together well, but they also had places where their styles conflicted. So Bob in particular liked you to write up materials in 3 parts. Everything should be in 3s: an introduction, your body, and a conclusion. Really rigid, formal structures, clearly broken out, intentionally highly repetitive to really drive a message home. Frank preferred a much more refined and graceful one-pager. It should be 1 page, always on a page. If your idea was too small to fill up a page, probably wasting everybody's time. And once an idea was bigger than a page, to show true mastery of it, you needed to be able to manipulate the information to fit in any size. In particular, a page, because most people taking a thing seriously will read a page. They might not read two, but they'll read one. And so I was working with these two guys, and along comes a piece of the project where we need to do an update. And so I sit down and I craft this gorgeous one-page document in 3 parts and perfectly structured and all of Bob's very particular formatting and Frank's concept of one page. And I worked so hard on that thing, and I was so proud of it. Gave it to them, sat down, all nice and happy, and they hated every piece of it. They just hated it from beginning to end because I had followed their rules, but I didn't understand their purpose. And so I had taken all of the worst parts of both of their ideas and shoved them onto one page and made them both ridiculously unhappy about it. And they sent me off dutifully to do it again. And I had to start to understand the purpose of those rules and recognize that I was communicating with the director of IT, so I wanted to be in his format, not the other guy's format. Frank had a lot of good ideas. I like Frank's ideas better in many ways, but I was communicating with Bob, so I needed to meet Bob's standards. And understanding that, pulling those together and making sure I'm learning from both of those and getting at that purpose, having that conflict makes it easier to see where that is. Zooming in a little bit to slightly more technical and less generalized things. If you didn't get a degree in computer science, probably the most important thing you missed is the standard algorithms course. And even if you did get a CS degree, some of the material can be helpful to go back and revisit from time to time. The course is just essentially a collection of standard algorithms for searching and sorting and pathfinding and all kinds of basic stuff. And then you measure their performance and come to understand their performance under various conditions. And it's incredibly rare that you ever actually write these algorithms as a grown-up, because they're in the library, they're in the language. Unless you are writing a language or writing a library, the chances that you need to implement quicksort on an in-place array, really small, not terribly useful for most of us most of the time. And in fact, we should be using the version in a library because it's probably better optimized for the overall platform. It's probably going to perform better than anything we can write in a less idealized environment. So that's not the important piece. And it's not even necessarily all of the details of the formal measures, just knowing how to work out a big own performance of an algorithm in like formal detail and be able to rigorously prove it. Not super important most of the time. I have had it come up. I have had developers pick fights with me where it got to the point of like, fine, we'll go work this out. And I will show you that your algorithm is terrible. But the vast majority of the time, the difference is the instinct. It gives you practice at looking at an algorithm and figuring out how it's going to perform. Looking at our algorithm and say, it's going to be fine under my 5 test records in the test suite. It's probably going to do just fine in 500 records when I get it into UAT. But this system's going to go to 5 million, and I'm toast somewhere out past 5,000. That this thing is not going to scale the way I need it to, and I'm going to have to take preventative steps to deal with that somewhere along the way. To recognize I'm pulling a lot of loops over this data set in here. I got to find a way to combine them so that I'm running fewer loops and doing more work in each so that I can improve the overall performance. Those are the kinds of things you start to pick up when you do these exercises over and over and over again. And they're the kinds of distinctions I can often tell people who have formal CS training versus people who've just been a developer a long time by whether or not they're able to actually do this on the fly. You can go watch the MIT lectures for all this stuff. They're all up free. You can get, the homeworks and the answer keys and all that stuff. I do suggest if you actually do it that way, and it is a highly effective way, it's not the only way to develop those instincts, but it's a very effective way, that you actually engage. Right? It's not just like watch the video while you're, cooking dinner or have it on in the background. Like it's intense intellectual stuff. And even if you have a CS degree, if it's not from an elite top flight institution, if you go watch the lectures from MIT, yeah, they're probably including some stuff that got left out of yours. Certainly they included stuff that got left out of mine. And addressed stuff that I'm not sure I would have frankly been able to handle at 20, that by the time I rewatched all those lectures at 30, I could roll with. So it's a useful exercise even for people who've done it before. The more programming languages you know, the easier it is to continue to adapt. For most developers who are new to a platform, particularly if you're coming from a place where you don't have a lot of formal training, you learn the languages of the platform. So right in Drupal, that means we learn PHP, JavaScript, and CSS HTML. If you know people who went through a formal program potentially and learned all C-like languages, C and C# and C++, and then went and worked at a .NET shop where they probably learned C# and TypeScript, which is JavaScript made to look like C#. All of those things kind of pigeonhole them in one suite of languages. They don't necessarily have that broad depth. But the more languages you know, it'll make you a better developer, at least within some level of reason. And yeah, it'll also make you more resistant to market shifts. Like if you go out and need to find a job next week and you only know PHP, you're only applying for PHP jobs. If you know PHP and C# and Python, that's three languages you get to apply in. But more importantly, when you learn a new programming language, it often will make you better in your primary language. Again, particularly when you're working through 5 or 6 or 7 languages. When I learned PHP, it was as a replacement for ASP Classics. This is PHP 3. It was a fairly bad language. ASP was probably the only language on the web worse than it. And the state of the web was pretty awful. Kind of amazing, the garbage that they let us get away with. And so I learned PHP in this very limited place to replace kind of form processing for custom built stuff with a very little bit of database interaction, horribly insecure code, all kinds of terrible things. And then this guy, Frank, had said, you should learn a language every year. And so, all right, blindly following the rules, off I went and I learned Python because I needed to learn a language the next year. And Python is a really different language than the languages most people work in most of the time, although it's super popular for reasons. And I knew several languages when I learned it, but it was still very different than a lot of what I'd worked with. It does things like, instead of using curly braces or any demarker for the beginning and end of control structures, it's how far things are indented. So you become super careful about white space in a big hurry, because otherwise your code will not compile and run. And it doesn't have any switch statements. Guido, its inventor, doesn't like them because he thinks it encourages really bad code writing. And he's right. I love switch statements, by the way. And I've done some evil things with them. I think they're really great and useful, but there are times you do really nasty things with them, particularly in languages like PHP that are untyped. And people will get away with all kinds of murder in their switch statements that they really shouldn't be doing. And in Python, they're just gone. And instead, you do a lot of list processing. You pump in all of your options into an array, and then you process that array, whether it's finding a key and hitting a callable, or just checking for a value in an array, or reslicing the array to reorganize it. You do a lot of list processing. After I learned Python, I came back to PHP because I was starting to work with Drupal. And I realized that not only was I bringing back some of these design patterns, that I became passionate about white space. It's the first thing, anytime I set up a new IDE, I will first figure out all of its controls for white space. And Ty can tell you, now and then, I will do things like open up a code file, notice all of the white space is inconsistent, and just resave it so that my IDE cleans up all the tabs and spaces and makes all the line endings consistent and relays everything out. And then I just commit that one white space change. And I don't ever want to get into like a war with another developer over white space, but I want it perfect every time. And it makes it easier to read. It makes it easier for other people to take it on when it's just properly formatted when you're opening it. You're not going, what happened to this? What's going on here? You can really get it sorted. But more importantly, Drupal uses a lot of really complex lists and arrays. We love to shove things in giant arrays, and we just call them the rendering engine or the form control, right? The whole form API is a giant array. It's a massive predefined set of arrays. And so when I came back, I now had all these skills from Python, and I kind of started working with PHP in a more Pythonic way and thinking about ways to do it. And I picked up some design patterns that when I started looking at the Drupal core code, I realized that I'm not particularly unique in this, that some of these things are really useful, that if you start glomming all your stuff into an array and then check to see if it's in there, you can do a massive OR statement really fast by just putting all of your OR values into the array and then just saying, is this in the array? Is my value in array? Then do that. And you've just OR'd everything in it. And until PHP 7, these were also radically faster than giant control structures because of how PHP 5 and before were optimized. They're not radically faster anymore. They run about the same speed, best I can tell, but they have been dramatic optimizations. It's why they're deep in the core, deep in the Drupal code. They are really nice design patterns. They're really maintainable. They're highly performant. And in other interpreted languages, they're often still very performant. So I really encourage people to try to learn a language a year to you're like 5, 6, 7 languages in. I will say I've maintained that as an average over my career. I have not learned a new language every year, but I'm 20 odd years in and I'm 20 odd languages in. I wouldn't give any of them back. I don't think I've got any of them a waste of my time, even though I never use Haskell. I haven't looked at Scheme in decades, but it's useful to have had crammed it into my head at one point and learned it. Like learning another language, learning other platforms is a way to broaden your view of technology and get you out of your professional bubble. And it has that same nice nature of like, hey, I can go into a job interview and say, I know Drupal and Salesforce, and that's more appealing than if I say, I just know Drupal, or I just know Salesforce. Being able to say you know both means I can walk into an interview that's going to include a third platform and say, no, with confidence, say, no, I don't know that platform, but I know I can learn it. And I can prove to you that I have learned other platforms. So trust me, I've done it before, I can do it again. I will learn whatever you need me to learn. And the ethos of every platform is a little bit different. So when I came into the Salesforce world in a really rigorous, sustained way in the last couple of years, I brought with me everything I knew from the Drupal community. And I'm still in the Drupal community, and I still do talks like this. And frankly, a talk like this is not actually something you would necessarily do much in the Salesforce space because it's kind of assumed we're all pushing ourselves out all the time really aggressively because Salesforce requires it of us. It is part of working at a Salesforce partner is an expectation of ongoing certification and training. And so it means I'm surrounded by a team that does this constantly. And there's an expectation from leadership that they can pick up the phone or more likely send an email and say, hey, Aaron, we need somebody who knows platform X and we kind of need it fast. And you seem to have some downtime right now. Go. And they have some faith that they can do that with almost anybody on the team. And we're going to turn around in a few weeks and say, what you got? I'm ready to go. Throw me a real project. Let me dig in. Let me get my teeth dirty. I really want to bite into this thing. And it's just part of doing it. On the flip side, Drupal has some real advantages on things like tooling and project structure that the Salesforce community is frankly still playing some catch up on. They kind of got behind. And there are problems that I've talked to developers at Salesforce who are like, man, some of these are really hard problems. And I'm like, yeah, Drupal does this in core, like this your configuration management stuff. We've got a powerful, elegant solution to all the dependency checking is kind of just there these days. Doesn't require a lot of human detail intervention. Our system just does it. You guys could totally do this. And you have all the data structures. What you don't have are the tools. But these tools can be written. And I've been in conversations with Salesforce in-house developers who kind of were impressed at what Drupal just kind of does and had never had that assumption thrown at them of like, yes, this is not only a solvable problem, but other people have solved it. And the solution is for you to just sit down and do it. Like it's there. You can go steal other people's code and concepts and apply it to your platform, and we can get there. That both communities can teach and inform each other, and I learn and get smarter working with both, and I can push back in both directions. The last general concept I want to share is the notion of sharing what you think you know. Not waiting till you've got it all right, but giving talks, writing blog posts, teaching classes, teaching other colleagues, whatever works and is comfortable for you, and getting yourself out there before you think you're fully done. when you're teaching or sharing information, it forces you to focus and organize your thoughts and your ideas. This talk started as kind of my having a series of conversations in both Drupal and Salesforce communities about kind of professional development and all kinds of related stuff. And I couldn't quite bring the thoughts together in those conversations the way I wanted. And so I wrote a blog post back in December that went over kind of a series of things that then I kind of got hung up on these ideas, and I'm still pushing on them and I'm still pushing around. So I want to do this talk and put this talk together. And I think I still have a ways to go and some refinement to do, but it's helped me start to bring it together and land some of my thinking. The woman here was out at Art in the Heart in Augusta this last year, and she is obviously impressing part of her audience. She was selling works, having happy customers, moving product, being a generally successful fiber artist. But my mother-in-law is also a fiber artist, has a loom almost exactly like that one. I had to move it around at Christmas time this year. It's my mother-in-law's small loom. It may be this woman's small loom. She may have a nicer one that doesn't come out to work out on the street. But it means that Beth and I have an eye for that technical detail of the craft and looking at the quality of the final product in a way that's not typical. And I can tell you that my mother-in-law is a better weaver than she is. Now, she is a way better weaver than I am. She is probably a way better weaver than my sister-in-law. But she doesn't have that consistency of tension that really marks a true expert master craftsman. She's getting there. In the meantime, she's instructing people on the street. She is selling products. She's being successful right now. She is making the world, better, hopefully, through her work and making people happy through her work today with imperfect work. You don't have to wait till we're all perfect to be able to provide valuable, useful contribution. And we all learn in the process, both from hearing other people's imperfect ideas and from getting our own imperfect ideas tested. So with all that comes out to is, I can't necessarily tell you what's going to work for you. I don't know where you're going next in your career. I don't know what learning styles you have. I don't know what works into the day-to-day routine of your life and allows you to have a livable life and be doing extra work for work. I don't know the right balance of that for you, for any of it. So I just want to close this by opening up to a discussion about your ideas, what works for you, what I've missed, feedback you have, anything along that lines, and just have a bit of an open discussion about where you want to go. And thank you.
Great topic and presentation.
Thank you.
I felt a lot of that, and I've been through a lot of that as someone who majored in art, graphic design in college, who is now a full stack developer. Everything I know is self-learning. I went through everything that you went through, that you mentioned. A lot of it hit home really hard. Particularly about sharing information too. I found that when I shared what I knew, it either confirmed what I know or I learned something new about what I should have known or was wrong about. So there is a lot of value in sharing what you know at the time. So I thought that was a great point, and
thank you.
I agree.
Yeah, great presentation, Aaron.
Was that it, or do you have a second thought?
No, I was just thinking about how to ask it, but yeah, I would be interested to know too. I mean, what other sort of interests people may have. I mean, what's I guess even outside the Drupal, I was actually going to over the weekend. I recently just got into, or kind of dove headfirst into Gatsby and redoing my blog, because that's I don't know if it's, I forgot I had it for a while. So there was, yeah, I think the last post was from, shame to say, 2013. So it's been a while. But no, I put a lot of work in that this weekend, so I'm excited to get that going. But also interested in learning more about how it interacts with Drupal. So, if anybody was interested in doing that, maybe I could do a talk about it in the next few months, if there's any interest for that.
I think a talk on Gatsby and Drupal, or folks bringing, I mean, those communities are running together so much right now. I think there's some cool stuff there. I think it'd be great.
Cool.
And we're always looking for topics. Anybody who wants to give a talk, we're always open to people sharing what they have or what they think they have.
Well, I thought that presentation was very good, and it really hits home for me also. I'm going to show my age, but yeah, I had courses in college, and we started with cards, punch cards.
Mm-hmm.
And I made, Fortran and Cobalt. I made a little space program. I'm very proud of it. And since I've never had any formal training, everything I've done was self-taught. So that really hits home. I wrote a program in Access, and we've used it for going on 30 years now. And
it's amazing how some of those things can just keep on trucking.
Yeah. And never had any formal training, nor have I talked to anybody that knows anything about it. There was one person about 20 years ago that had done the same stuff I was doing, and we kind of compared notes, and because we were reconciling invoices and piecework, and mine had to match his. And so we both came up with this Access program that did it, and we could do what would probably take people a week to do in a matter of minutes, because it went through and found the discrepancies right away. And but I would have learned so much, and I started just like you said. I found what worked and left it at that. But as I learned more, I found the right way to do it. So this program I have is looks like a kid did it. But then some of it looks like somebody who knew what they were doing, and it's sitting there together. But it works. So I understand exactly what you're saying, if it works. And it's too much work to go back and change everything, but it's still working today.
I like the notion of one of the slides that said, I forgot the exact words, but it was something along the lines of, just because you're successful doesn't mean you know it all. That's what I got out of it. And I really appreciate that, just because that's the way I see things too. Just because that person's successful, I know they don't know everything. Vice versa, even if people consider me to be successful, I'm still like, I don't know it all, man. Like, I'm still learning every day, but that's half the fun. Like,
you don't know what you don't know.
I find that actually less frustrating than places where I sit there and I can see the giant chasm of information I don't have. Like, oh, that's a lot I got to figure out. I kind of get to the top of that first hill and go, oh, I've kind of figured out like this tiny little sliver. Now there's this whole vista ahead of me.
But I'll do exactly what you said. Once I find a problem, I've got to solve it. I just can't go on to the next thing. I've got to stay on that until I solve it. So that's why I joined this group, because it would have done so much for me if I'd known somebody that I just talk about what you say. This is what I'm doing. These are other ideas.
And
it's such a big help.
I think back to the folks I've met at various points in my career who kind of were that holdout person who was the last, usually man, standing on some antique piece of hardware or software that they were just bound and determined to defend with every ounce of their energy. And nobody really liked that person anymore. They get the best retirement parties. Because half the people in the room are like, oh, we can finally get rid of that thing that's been driving us all, but nobody's had the kind of political or institutional will. I never want to be that person. Like, I don't want to be the guy who's like, he's finally retiring.
You don't want to pass on technical debt to future developers.
That too, but it's a slightly different thing because there's always a little technical, like as much as I'd like to do all technical debt.
If you can mitigate it,
it's when you're the technical debt. I don't want to be the technical debt. I recognize grudgingly that I will leave some behind for others I just don't want to be the debt that's causing everybody to, like I said, throw just a killer retirement party. And at the end, they're all like, don't let the dog, actually, go ahead, let the dog hit you. It's fine. Yeah, definitely have gone through some lengths to try to avoid ever getting that place.
I think the most challenging thing that I've encountered teaching myself is sometimes there are moments where I feel like I can't talk to anyone about this. Most of my friends aren't into programming, and if say I was a new employee and I was reluctant to kind of reach out to people, I just kind of, how do I teach myself this, and just kind of feeling like the uphill battle, but getting over that, and reaching out further into the community, like even people who I will never see, like on Drupal.org, on the Drupal chats, getting involved in communities like this, able to, meet like-minded individuals to share ideas with. If I talk about arrays with some of my friends, they're just like, "Shut up, dude! Like, we don't know what you're talking about, and we don't care."
And some for me has always been finding those places of like, where can I reach out further to get outside the bubble that, like, I know someone must have suffered with this. I'm not that creative. It's incredibly rare to be so creative to hit a problem that no one else has ever hit. So it's how do you find those edges of the bubble? I mean, that's some of honestly part of why I started keeping a blog, and particularly a blog of technical stuff, is it's a place to get, particularly on harder problems. I come up with a solution, and I haven't found anybody else publishing a solution, and so I kind of put one out there with the full recognition that some of the feedback can be like, that part doesn't work, or you're just wrong about this thing over here. And to me, it's super helpful, because it's one of those, like, I'm publishing this because I had to run like 87 Google searches to find all the bits and pieces. There's no one published solution that I can find. So hopefully other people will find it, and then they'll tell me why mine sucks so I can fix it and do better. But otherwise I'm stuck with like, I don't know, we're stuck at that, like, here it is. It kind of works, I guess. Maybe it's secure, maybe it's efficient. Maybe I'm in left field on my own.
That should be a life hack right there, because if you ask people for what they think about it, they won't review it. But if you just put it up, they'll tear it apart.
Yeah, I listen, most of the feedback I've gotten most of the time has been constructive and helpful, or has been places people saying, like, there's one of the more popular pieces I wrote about how to do some relatively esoteric stuff, and it's become clearly it still must be one of the top search results for most people, because it gets a lot of Google inbound traffic, and is consistently one of the top rated things. And there have definitely over time, as Drupal has changed, there have been places like, this piece doesn't work anymore. You need to enable this extra module now. That what used to be in this one module has been split out into this other, and so you have to make sure you tell people to turn them both on, or this whole thing doesn't work. And there's some other stuff like that have kind of gotten that feedback that help me understand, like, oh, I better go turn that on my project, so I know how to make sure this is working, not just assume it's going to magically continue to function.
Well, that's the thing about nowadays, because you can go on and search the issues, whereas years ago you couldn't.
Oh, I mean, I was a developer before Stack Overflow. No idea how I did anything. Not a clue. I was a developer for a long time before Stack Overflow. It was like, oh, wow.
Now it's the bread and butter of every programmer.
Oh, I mean, I had the Java API book. It was like that thick. It was huge.
And you use like maybe 10 pages of it.
Yeah, but you never knew which 10. You had no way to know. Like,
You remember those reference books that you used to buy?
In one place and search it.
Big heavy reference books. I got a whole bookshelf of them.
Yeah. I remember the Drupal ones, like the O'Reilly books. There were so many of them. I used to collect them. I still have so many of them. But now that I'm thinking about it, like, I don't remember the last time I actually got a new one. You know what I mean? Like, I used to have so many of them. I had like friends' books, people I knew wrote books, and like, yeah,
Yeah, it's definitely not. I don't use the O'Reilly books. I don't ever buy their programming books anymore. And I will totally admit the ones that are on my bookshelf in my office are there because my desk used to face the other direction. If you see me on video conference now, you'll know that I have a wall of pictures behind me. That's my new backdrop. I used to be turned around the other way, and it was my bookshelf of computer books. It was totally there to show off how many computer books I have. That is entirely why they are where they are. They have not moved since I put them up as my backdrop for video conferencing. And then I realized that if I turned my desk around, I was not backlit, and I only had to keep a tiny part of my office clean. If you have a home office, I highly recommend having the desk facing the room and the computer face the wall. And then you only have to keep a tiny little corner clean. You can just put a few decorative things up behind you. So much easier than a whole room. Took me like a year to figure that out.
Yeah, it took me a long time to get this place clean. Check out the new digs.
Let's see. I'll stop sharing so we can actually see the camera.
I like the green screen.
Yeah, he's on the other screen.
Oh, snap. That is nice. Look at all that light coming through there.
I have somehow gotten Zoom stuck halfway between screens.
Yeah, there's still sun where you're at.
Yeah. We're West Coast, That's
What's that?
There we go.
Look at that.
Got Will up on the big screen.
Wow. I like the light coming in.
Looks like he just moved in.
Is that a green? Green screen?
Yes, that's a generated room.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I was like, look at all this light. I'm like, wow, that's so awesome. Oh, you totally fooled me.
Oh, that's neat.
That is cool.
I have been to his house. There's no part of his house that looks like
I say,
it.
man, you really did a good job decorating there.
Yeah. Let's see what it really looks like.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, I finally got the hardware back to fix the camera, so hooray, virtual office is back. It's all built in Unreal too, so eventually, once I have more time to put into it, I want to actually model it out, and so I can go out to the coffee shop, you know what I mean, and just hit a button.
That's good.
Coffee.
Go around the corner to get a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
Have a cat walking in the background.
Yeah.
Well, he normally has dogs walking in the background in real life. Just
Oh, they have too on call. They'll run out from the side. They just come materialized though at one point. It's about right here. Yeah. They're like, wait.
Neat.